Sometimes a single moment can change everything about who you think you are. Luke Morrison was 16, angry and desperate to prove he feared nothing and no one. Standing in front of the Virgin Mary statue outside St. Catherine's School, he picked up stones and threw them while his classmates cheered and recorded. The sacred figure that had watched over Cedar Falls for generations shattered into pieces. Luke felt powerful, rebellious, untouchable. But just 24 hours later, everything changed. The same boy who destroyed what others held sacred was found crying in the old parish church where the broken statue now rested. His tears weren't from fear of getting in trouble. They came from somewhere much deeper, a place he didn't know existed inside him. What happened in just one day that broke down a defiant teenager completely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Falls, nestled in central Illinois farmland, where tradition ran deeper than old wells and 3 generations might share the same church pew. The Morrison house on Elm Street was modest. White clapboard with a weathered front porch where Margaret Morrison raised her 16-year-old son Luke alone after his father abandoned them 3 years earlier. The weathered leather Bible on Margaret's kitchen table had belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, and now served as her anchor through storms she never expected to weather alone. Where Margaret found comfort in faith and tradition, Luke felt suffocated. Every Sunday morning became a battlefield, every blessing before meals, a reminder of expectations he couldn't meet. The family Bible felt like a judge, documenting his failures to live up to the Morrison name. Luke inherited his mother's dark hair and stubborn streak, but wore both like weapons against the world. His father's absence left him angry in ways he couldn't articulate. Rage that simmered beneath his carefully cultivated image of rebellion at St. Catherine's School. Jake Henderson, his cautious best friend, served as both audience and accomplice to Luke's increasingly bold defiance. Ashley Martinez, his girlfriend of 6 months, was smart enough to recognize that Luke's rebellion masked something deeper and more troubling. St. Catherine's School stood at Cedar Falls' heart like a red brick monument to faith and learning. Founded in 1952, it served Catholic families within a 30-mile radius. The Memorial Garden housed the Virgin Mary statue that had stood for 40 years, commissioned in 1985 by families who lost children in a tragic school bus accident. Carved from Indiana limestone, it depicted Mary with outstretched arms, her face serene and compassionate. Over decades, the statue became a gathering place for prayer and reflection. Students touched Mary's robe for luck before tests. Parents paused there during school events, offering silent prayers for their children's futures. The statue accumulated layers of meaning and memory that made it far more than mere stone. Luke had grown up seeing that statue daily, but somewhere in his teenage years, it transformed from familiar landmark to symbol of everything oppressive about his life. The serene face seemed to judge his doubts. The outstretched arms demanded a surrender he wasn't willing to give. When other students paused there in reverence, Luke felt only resentment at their easy acceptance of beliefs that felt increasingly foreign. Principal Martinez, Ashley's father, ran St. Catherine's with firm but fair authority. His relationship with Luke had grown strained as Luke's attitude shifted from typical teenage boundary testing to outright defiance. Margaret worked as a secretary at the local insurance office, stretching every dollar to pay Luke's tuition at St. Catherine's, believing the structure and moral foundation would guide him through his difficult years. Luke's grandmother Elena, 78 and deeply devout, lived above the downtown bakery with her rosary beads within easy reach. She had raised Margaret after Luke's grandfather died young, instilling the deep Catholic faith that now sustained her daughter through single motherhood. Elena prayed daily for Luke's soul, worried about the anger growing in him like a poisonous weed. At St. Catherine's, Luke's rebellion made him both popular with students who admired his defiance and notorious among parents who worried about his influence. He attracted followers who lived vicariously through his boldness, while maintaining distance to avoid consequences. In recent weeks, his behavior had escalated, skipping chapel, talking back to teachers, challenging religious authority with particular pleasure. Luke's relationship with faith had once been simple, built on childhood acceptance and family tradition. But as he grew older, questions multiplied, and answers became less satisfying. Why had his father left if God held families together? Why did his mother struggle despite devotion and service? These doubts festered in silence, growing stronger as Luke felt isolated from the faith community surrounding him. The morning of the incident dawned crisp and clear, autumn sunlight filtering through maple trees lining the school walkways. Luke arrived at St. Catherine's in his usual dark mood, worsened by another argument with his mother about skipping Sunday Mass. He felt the familiar weight of expectations and disappointment, the sense that everyone possessed secret knowledge about faith and purpose that had been denied to him. The Virgin Mary statue seemed to mock him as he approached, its serene expression a reminder of peace that eluded him. As Luke walked past the memorial garden that morning, he had no idea that within hours his name would become synonymous with scandal throughout Cedar Falls. The statue he barely glanced at would soon lie in pieces, those broken fragments becoming the catalyst for a transformation he never saw coming. The morning chapel service at St. Catherine's was mandatory, but Luke Morrison had made an art of avoiding it. He lingered in the hallways, ducked into empty classrooms, and found creative excuses to be anywhere except kneeling in prayer with his classmates. This particular Tuesday morning, his luck ran out. Principal Martinez spotted Luke attempting to slip into the library during chapel time. "Mr. Morrison," the older man called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent dealing with rebellious teenagers. "I believe you're supposed to be in chapel with your fellow students." Luke turned slowly, his jaw already set in defiance. "I don't feel well, Principal Martinez. I was going to rest in the library until first period. You seem perfectly healthy." "To me," Principal Martinez stepped closer, his gray eyes studying Luke with the practiced gaze of an educator who had seen every excuse imaginable. "This is the third time this month you've missed chapel. Care to explain why you find it so difficult to spend 15 minutes in prayer and reflection?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Luke felt keenly. Around them, the hallways were empty, except for the distant sound of voices raised in morning hymns. Luke could feel the weight of expectation, the assumption that he would submit, apologize, and fall in line like a good Catholic school student. "Maybe because it's all meaningless," Luke said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Maybe because talking to empty air doesn't solve anything or change anything or help anyone." Principal Martinez's expression shifted from stern authority to genuine concern. He had watched Luke grow up in this school, had seen the bright, curious boy transform into this angry young man standing before him. "Luke, I understand you're going through a difficult time with your family situation, but you don't understand anything," Luke interrupted, his voice rising. "None of you understand. You just want us all to sit quietly and pray to a God who doesn't care about any of us." The chapel bell rang, signaling the end of morning prayers. Within moments, students would flood the hallways, and this confrontation would become public spectacle. Principal Martinez made a quick decision. "Report to my office after school today. We need to have a longer conversation about your attitude and your future at this school." He paused, his voice softening slightly. "And, Luke, your mother deserves better than this. She's sacrificing a great deal to keep you here." As Principal Martinez walked away, Luke felt the familiar burn of anger mixed with shame. He knew his mother worked extra hours to afford the tuition, knew she defended him to neighbors who whispered about his behavior. But knowing made it worse, not better. The guilt fed his rage instead of tempering it. Students began emerging from the chapel, their faces reflecting the peace and purpose that Luke envied and resented in equal measure. Jake Henderson appeared at his side, concern evident in his expression. "Dude," Martinez looked really upset. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing." "He didn't need to hear," Luke muttered, but even as he said it he felt uncertain. The defiance that had felt so justified moments earlier now seemed hollow and childish. Ashley Martinez approached them, her dark eyes flashing with worry and frustration. As the principal's daughter, she walked a careful line between loyalty to her father and her feelings for Luke. "What happened? My dad looked like he was ready to suspend someone." "Your dad needs to mind his own business," Luke said, immediately regretting the harshness in his voice when he saw Ashley flinch. "Luke, you can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "You can't keep attacking everything and everyone just because you're angry." The words stung because they contained truth Luke wasn't ready to face. Instead of acknowledging her point, he did what he always did when cornered by uncomfortable emotions. He lashed out. "Maybe I should attack something that actually matters to people around here," he said, his voice carrying a reckless edge that made Jake take a step back. "Maybe then they'd pay attention." Ashley's eyes widened. "Luke, don't—" But he was already walking away, his anger propelling him toward the doors that led outside to the memorial garden. Students parted before him, sensing the dark energy radiating from his every step. Jake called his name, but Luke ignored him, focused only on the burning need to do something, anything, that would make the rage inside him feel justified. The memorial garden was empty in the mid-morning sunlight. The Virgin Mary statue stood as it had for 40 years, limestone weathered smooth by decades of Illinois weather. Her arms remained outstretched in eternal welcome, her face serene and compassionate. To Luke, staring at her now, she seemed to embody everything he couldn't be: peaceful, accepting, beloved by everyone who saw her. A small group of students had gathered at the windows overlooking the garden, drawn by the intensity they had witnessed in the hallway. Ashley was among them, her hand pressed to the glass, her face pale with growing alarm. Jake stood beside her, his phone already in his hand, though he hadn't yet decided whether to call for help or simply record whatever was about to happen. Luke bent down and picked up a handful of decorative stones from the garden border. They were smooth river rocks, chosen for their beauty and placed carefully around the flower beds that surrounded the statue. In Luke's hands, they felt heavy and significant, like weapons waiting to be deployed. "This is what everyone cares about," he said to the statue, his voice loud enough to carry to the windows where students watched in growing horror. "This piece of rock that's supposed to solve all our problems." He drew back his arm and threw the first stone. It struck Mary's outstretched hand with a sharp crack that echoed across the garden. A chip of limestone fell to the ground, and Luke felt a momentary surge of power, of control over something in his chaotic world. Inside the building, students gasped and pointed. Someone ran to get Principal Martinez. Ashley pounded on the window, shouting Luke's name, but the glass muffled her voice. Luke picked up another stone, larger this time. The first throw had broken something inside him loose, some restraint that had kept him from crossing lines he couldn't uncross. The second stone struck Mary's face, creating a spiderweb of cracks across the serene limestone features. "Luke, stop!" Ashley's voice finally reached him as she burst through the garden doors, Jake close behind her. "Please, just stop." But Luke was beyond stopping. The rage that had been building for 3 years, since his father left, since the prayers failed to bring him back, since the family Bible became a silent accusation of his inadequacy, poured out in a torrent of destruction. He threw stone after stone, each impact sending fragments of the beloved statue scattering across the carefully tended garden. Jake had his phone out now, recording instinctively, even as he watched his best friend destroy his future with every thrown stone. Other students pressed against the windows, their phones also capturing the shocking scene. The videos would be uploaded to social media within minutes, spreading Luke's act of destruction far beyond the walls of St. Catherine's. The Virgin Mary's face cracked and partially shattered, seemed to watch Luke with infinite sadness as he picked up the largest stone he could find. This final throw was aimed at her heart, at the center of the figure that had offered comfort to thousands of believers over 4 decades. The impact was devastating. Mary's torso cracked deeply, pieces of limestone falling away to reveal the hollow core where the sculptor had carved out weight to prevent the statue from toppling. The sound of breaking stone was like a physical blow to everyone watching, final and irrevocable. Principal Martinez arrived as Luke dropped his hands to his sides, chest heaving from exertion and emotion. The older man took in the scene, the broken statue, the scattered fragments, his daughter Ashley standing frozen in shock, and Luke Morrison looking suddenly very young and very lost in the middle of the destruction he had caused. "Luke," Principal Martinez said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment and sorrow. "What have you done?" For a moment, Luke stared at the broken statue, seeing clearly for the first time what his rage had accomplished. The serene face was shattered, the welcoming arms fractured, the symbol of faith and comfort reduced to rubble and sharp edges. Around him, students stood in stunned silence, their phones still recording, documenting the moment Luke Morrison destroyed something that could never be repaired. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a growing hollow sensation in his chest. But it was too late for regret, too late for apologies. The damage was done, recorded, and already spreading across the digital landscape that would ensure everyone in Cedar Falls and beyond would know what he had done. Luke looked at the broken stone fragments scattered at his feet and felt something shift inside him, though he couldn't yet name what it was. The Virgin Mary statue lay in ruins, but something else had broken in that garden, something inside Luke himself that would prove far more difficult to repair. The silence in Principal Martinez's office was deafening. Luke sat in the chair, across from the desk where he had been summoned countless times over the past 2 years, but this time felt different. The disciplinary file that Principal Martinez was methodically building contained documentation of every infraction, every act of defiance, and now this, the destruction of school property that held deep spiritual significance for the entire community. Principal Martinez set down his pen and looked directly at Luke, his face reflecting the weight of a decision no educator wanted to make. "Luke, in 30 years of working in Catholic education, I have never encountered such blatant disrespect for sacred property." Luke stared at his hands, unable to meet the older man's gaze. The rage that had fueled his actions just hours earlier had evaporated, leaving behind a strange emptiness that he didn't know how to interpret. The broken stone fragments from the Virgin Mary statue had been carefully collected and now sat in boxes in the school's storage room, waiting for decisions about repair or replacement that would cost thousands of dollars the school didn't have. "The statue has been part of this community for 40 years, Principal Martinez continued, his voice heavy with disappointment. It was commissioned by families who lost children, blessed by Bishop McCarthy, and cherished by generations of students and their families. It wasn't just stone, Luke. It was a symbol of hope and faith that meant something profound to people who are now heartbroken by what you've done." The words hit Luke like physical blows, each one adding weight to the growing sense of dread in his stomach. He had known the statue was important to people, but in his anger, he had focused only on what it represented to him: judgment, expectation, impossible standards of faith and behavior. He hadn't considered the children who had touched Mary's robe for luck before tests, the parents who had prayed there for their families, the generations of believers who had found comfort in her presence. "I'm suspending you for 2 weeks, Principal Martinez said, opening the disciplinary file and adding another form to the growing collection. "During that time, the school board and I will meet to determine whether you can return to St. Catherine's at all." The destruction of the statue, combined with your increasingly defiant behavior, raises serious questions about whether this environment is appropriate for you. Luke's head snapped up. You can't kick me out. My mom, she's worked so hard to, won't keep me here. Your mother has indeed sacrificed greatly for your education, Principal Martinez agreed, which makes your actions today even more disappointing. She deserves better than having to defend a son who destroys sacred property and shows contempt for the values she holds dear. The drive home was the longest 15 minutes of Luke's life. Margaret had been called to pick him up from school, and her silence filled the car like a living thing. Luke could see her knuckles white on the steering wheel, could feel the disappointment radiating from her in waves. When they pulled into their driveway, she sat for a long moment before turning to look at him. The Virgin Mary statue, she said, quietly. The one that was there when I went to St. Catherine's. The one your grandmother prayed at when she was worried about me. That statue, Luke. Luke nodded, unable to speak. Seeing his mother's face, crumpled with grief and disappointment, was worse than any punishment Principal Martinez could have imposed. Margaret Morrison had defended her son through every phone call from the school, every complaint from neighbors, every whispered criticism at church. But this was different. This was indefensible. Why, she whispered, why would you destroy something so beautiful, something that meant so much to so many people? Luke opened his mouth to explain about the anger, about feeling trapped by expectations, about the statue seeming to judge him for his doubts. But the words sounded petty and selfish, even in his own mind. How could he explain that he had destroyed something sacred because it made him feel bad about himself? I don't know, he said finally, and it was the truth. In the clarity that followed his rage, he truly didn't understand what had driven him to pick up those stones. Margaret closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. Go to your room. I need to think about what happens next. The house felt different when Luke walked inside. The family Bible on the kitchen table seemed to watch him pass, and every religious artifact, the cross on the living room wall, the picture of the Sacred Heart in the hallway, the rosary beads his grandmother had given. His mother felt like an accusation. He had declared war on faith itself, and now his own home felt like enemy territory. News of the incident spread through Cedar Falls with the speed that only scandal can achieve in a small town. Mrs. Henderson called to tell Margaret that Jake wouldn't be allowed to spend time with Luke anymore. Mrs. Patterson from down the street crossed to the other side when she saw Margaret getting the mail. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when Margaret entered an aisle, resuming in whispers after she passed. The videos taken by students had been uploaded to social media within an hour of the incident. Luke's destruction of the Virgin Mary statue played on repeat across Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, gathering comments that ranged from shock and condemnation to a few disturbing cheers from anti-religious trolls. The Morrison family name, carefully built over 3 generations of faithful service to the community, was being destroyed as thoroughly as Luke had destroyed the statue. Elena Morrison arrived at the house that evening, her face showing every one of her 78 years. She had walked the 6 blocks from her apartment, her rosary beads clutched in her weathered hands, her heart heavy with grief for her grandson's soul. "Me, Joe," she said, as Luke emerged from his room at his mother's insistence. She had called him by that affectionate Spanish term since he was small, but now it carried notes of profound sadness. "What have you done to yourself?" Luke couldn't meet her eyes. His grandmother had been a constant source of love and support. Throughout his life, the one person who never criticized, never demanded explanations, never made him feel inadequate. Seeing disappointment in her face was almost unbearable. "I don't understand how the boy I raised could do such a thing," Elena continued, sinking into the living room chair that had become hers during her frequent visits. "The Virgin Mary, Luke, the Mother of God. How could you raise your hand against her?" "It's just a statue, Grandma," Luke said. but the words sounded hollow even to him. Elena shook her head slowly. No, mijo. It was never just a statue. It was faith made visible. It was hope carved in stone. It was the love of families who needed something beautiful to help them remember that even in grief, God remains present. She pulled her rosary beads from her pocket, the worn silver catching the lamplight. These beads are just metal and string, but they carry my prayers. That statue was just stone, but it carried the prayers of thousands of people over 40 years. Luke felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the wall he had built around his heart. His grandmother's words painted a picture of the statue he had never considered, not as a symbol of judgment, but as a vessel for hope, love, and comfort. The children who had touched Mary's robe, the parents who had prayed there for their families, the grieving who had found solace in her presence, all of them had lost something precious because of his anger. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said quietly, and it was true. In his rage, he had thought only of striking back at the forces that seemed to crush him. He hadn't considered the collateral damage, the innocent faith that would be wounded by his rebellion. Elena reached out and took his hand in her soft, wrinkled ones. "I know, mijo, but sometimes the things we don't mean to do cause the most pain. The question now is what you're going to do about it." That night, Luke lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Virgin Mary's face cracking under the impact of his stones. He heard the sound of breaking limestone, saw the fragments scattering across the memorial garden, remembered the shocked faces of his classmates as they witnessed his act of destruction. For the first time since picking up those stones, Morrison began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. And in that understanding, the first seeds of genuine remorse began to take root in the wasteland his anger had created. Elena Morrison's rosary beads had been worn smooth by decades of faithful prayer. The silver chain showed patches of tarnish, and several of the small medallions bore scratches from years of being handled during moments of hope, fear, and desperate petition. She tried to press them into Luke's hands during her visit, but he pulled away as if the beads might burn him. "I can't, Grandma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve to touch anything holy." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. In all her years of faith, through the death of her husband, the struggles of raising Margaret alone, and the heartbreak of watching Luke drift away from God, she had never encountered such complete spiritual desolation. Her grandson wasn't just angry at faith, he was convinced he had placed himself beyond its reach. "Faith isn't something you earn, mijo," she said gently, setting the rosary on the table between them. "It's something you receive, like grace, like forgiveness." Luke stared at the rosary beads but didn't touch them. The gap between his grandmother's gentle faith and his own spiritual emptiness felt like an unbridgeable chasm. How could he pray when every prayer felt like hypocrisy? How could he ask for forgiveness when he wasn't even sure he deserved it? Margaret had barely spoken to Luke in the 3 days since the incident. She left for work early and returned late, communicating only through notes left on the kitchen counter about meals and household responsibilities. The family Bible remained on the table, but she no longer read from it during their silent dinners. Luke felt its presence like a weight, a reminder of the faith tradition he had violated and the family harmony he had shattered. The suspension from St. Catherine's left Luke with empty days to contemplate what he had done. Without the structure of school, the hours stretched endlessly. He couldn't concentrate on television or books, couldn't find interest in the video games that had once entertained him for hours. The few friends who still spoke to him did so only through text messages, and those conversations felt strained and artificial. On Thursday morning, Principal Martinez called Margaret with Luke's community service assignment. As part of his disciplinary action, Luke would spend 40 hours working on the grounds of St. Mary's Catholic Church under the supervision of the groundskeeper, Tom Brennan. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The boy who had destroyed sacred property would now be responsible for maintaining sacred space. Tom Brennan was 72, gruff, and had been tending the church grounds for nearly 20 years. He had known the Morrison family since Margaret was a child, had watched Luke grow up in those pews, and had heard about the statue incident from at least a dozen parishioners. When Luke arrived for his first day of service, Tom's greeting was civil but cool. You'll be weeding flower beds, raking leaves, and helping me repair the fence behind the parish hall, Tom said without preamble. I don't care what your problems are or why you did what you did. I care that you work hard and show some respect for this place. Luke nodded silently and followed Tom to the tool shed. The physical labor was actually a relief. It gave his hands something to do and his mind something to focus on, besides the growing weight of guilt that seemed to increase each day. As he worked, pulling weeds from around the church's memorial plaques, he couldn't help but notice the care that had gone into every aspect of the grounds. Each flower bed was precisely maintained, each pathway carefully swept, each memorial marker lovingly tended. During his lunch break on the second day, Luke found himself reading the memorial plaques he had been weeding around. They bore the names of parishioners who had died over the decades, along with brief inscriptions about their service to the church community. Sarah Henderson, beloved mother and church organist. Michael O'Brien, devoted father and volunteer firefighter. Elena Santos, faithful servant and prayer group leader. They all meant something to somebody, Tom said, noticing Luke's attention to the plaques. Every name there represents a life that mattered, a family that grieved, a community that remembered. He paused in his own work to look at Luke directly. That statue you destroyed, it was like one of these plaques, only bigger. It represented all the people who had found comfort there over 40 years. The words hit Luke like a physical blow. He had been so focused on his own anger and rebellion that he had never considered the statue as a memorial, a marker of faith and hope for countless individuals whose names he would never know. Children who had prayed there before tests, parents who had sought guidance about their families, elderly parishioners who had found solace in Mary's presence during their final years. That evening, Luke attempted to talk to his mother about what he was learning through the community service, but Margaret remained distant. She acknowledged his words with nods and brief responses, but the warmth that had always characterized their relationship remained absent. Luke began to understand that his actions had damaged more than stone. They had fractured his mother's trust in ways that might prove irreparable. Ashley Martinez had stopped returning Luke's text messages after the first day. Jake Henderson's parents had formally forbidden contact between the boys. Luke's social isolation deepened as he realized that his act of rebellion had accomplished the opposite of what he had intended. Instead of striking back at forces that made him feel powerless, he had surrendered what little power and connection he had possessed. On Friday afternoon, while cleaning debris from around the church's outdoor stations of the cross, Luke encountered Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly parishioner who had attended St. Catherine's decades earlier when her own children were students. She was placing fresh flowers at the 7th station, where Jesus falls the second time. "You're the Morrison boy," she said, not unkindly but without warmth, "the one who broke the Virgin." Luke stopped his work, unsure how to respond. Mrs. Rodriguez was small and frail, but her dark eyes held a strength that made him feel exposed and uncomfortable. "My daughter Maria was baptized in front of that statue," she continued, adjusting the flowers with careful precision. 35 years ago, she died of leukemia when she was 12, and I used to pray there every day for months afterward. That statue saw more of my tears than any person did." Luke's hands trembled as he gripped his rake. The personal cost of his actions was becoming clearer with each conversation, each story, each face of someone whose faith had been wounded by his rebellion. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words feeling inadequate and small. Mrs. Rodriguez studied his face for a long moment, "Sorry is a start," she said finally, "but sorry doesn't fix what's broken. Sorry doesn't give me back the place where I felt closest to my daughter's memory." She finished arranging the flowers and walked away, leaving Luke alone with the Station of the Cross that depicted Jesus falling under the weight of his burden. For the first time, Luke wondered if he understood something about that weight, about the crushing responsibility of carrying consequences that affected so many others. That night, Luke lay in bed thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter, about the families who had lost children and found comfort in the Virgin Mary's presence, about the generations of believers whose faith had been concentrated in that limestone figure. His anger had been so focused on his own pain that he had been blind to the pain of others, deaf to the stories of love and loss that had made the statue sacred. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of broken stone and weeping faces of children he had never met and prayers he had silenced forever. The anonymous letters began arriving on Monday. Margaret found the first one slipped under their front door when she left for work. A plain white envelope with Morrison family written in careful block letters. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore a handwritten message that made her sink into the porch chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "Mrs. Morrison," it read, "I don't know your son personally, but I want you to know how much the Virgin Mary statue meant to my family. My grandmother took me there to pray when I was diagnosed with cancer at age 7. 20 years later, I took my own daughter there to pray when she was scared about starting school. Your son destroyed something that connected 3 generations of our family to God. I don't hate him, but I needed you to know what he took from us." Margaret's hand shook as she read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her purse. By evening, 2 more letters had appeared. One tucked under her car's windshield wiper, another left on her desk at the insurance office. Each contained a similar message, personal stories of faith, comfort, and connection that had been severed when Luke threw those stones. "My son touched the Virgin's robe before every basketball game. He said it gave him courage. I proposed to my wife in front of that statue because it represented the kind of love and devotion I wanted our marriage to have. When my husband was dying, I would sit with the Virgin Mary and feel less alone. She was like a friend who understood suffering." Margaret began collecting the letters in a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother. By the end of the week, she had received 14 of them. Each one was respectful, none were threatening, but together they painted a devastating picture of the communal wound Luke's actions had inflicted. She didn't show the letters to Luke, but they weighed on her constantly, adding layers to her. Grief that made normal conversation with her son feel impossible. Luke noticed his mother's growing withdrawal, but misinterpreted its cause. He thought she was simply angry about the suspension and potential expulsion from St. Catherine's. He didn't understand that she was drowning in other people's pain, that every letter forced her to confront the magnitude of what her son had destroyed. The key community service at St. Mary's continued, and Luke found himself forming an unexpected relationship with Tom Brennan. The older man's initial coldness had given way to a grudging respect for Luke's work ethic. Luke showed up on time, worked without complaint, and demonstrated a genuine care for the church grounds that surprised them both. "You've got good hands," Tom observed on Friday as they repaired a section of fence that separated the church property from the adjoining school playground. "Your grandfather was handy too. I remember him helping my father fix the church roof back in the 60s. It was the first time anyone had mentioned Luke's connection to the church's history in positive terms since the incident. Luke paused. In his work, curious about this grandfather he had barely known. "He died when I was 3, Luke said. Mom doesn't talk about him much." Tom nodded, pulling a bent nail from a fence board. "Roberto Morrison was a good man, quiet but reliable. He and your grandmother Elena were married in this church, you know. Your mother was baptized here, made her first communion at that altar in there." Luke felt a strange stirring in his chest, an awareness of roots and connections he had never considered. His family's relationship with faith wasn't just about rules and expectations. It was about belonging, about being part of something larger than individual struggles and doubts. Did he ever have problems with faith? Luke asked hesitantly. Did he ever doubt? Tom smiled slightly, the first genuine warmth Luke had seen from him. Everybody doubts, son. Faith isn't about never having questions. It's about asking the questions and still showing up, still caring for each other, still believing that love is stronger than hate. That afternoon, while Luke was weeding the flower beds around the church's outdoor stations of the cross, he encountered Father Miguel. The priest had been deliberately giving Luke space during his community service, understanding that forced conversation about faith might drive the boy further away. But seeing Luke working carefully around the religious displays, Father Miguel decided it was time for a gentle approach. "Luke," Father Miguel said, kneeling down beside him to help with the weeding, "how are you finding the work here?" Luke paused, unsure how to respond to the priest who had baptized him, confirmed him, and now had to deal with the aftermath of his destruction of sacred property. "It's okay," he said finally. "I like working with my hands. Your mother mentioned that you've always been good at fixing things around the house," Father Miguel said. "There's something holy about that kind of work, you know. Creating, repairing, making things beautiful. It's how we participate in God's ongoing creation of the world." Luke looked up sharply. "How can I participate in anything holy after what I did?" Father Miguel continued, weeding as he spoke, his hands gentle with the plants. "Do you know about the station of the cross you're working around? The 13th station, where Jesus is taken down from the cross?" Luke shook his head. "Even in death, Jesus was handled with love and care by people who wanted to honor him. Sometimes our worst moments become opportunities for other people to show grace." Luke didn't respond, but he thought about the conversation for the rest of the day. The idea that his destructive act might somehow create space for other people to demonstrate love and forgiveness seemed impossible, but he had already witnessed it in small ways. Tom Brennan's grudging mentorship, Father Miguel's patient kindness, even his mother's continued provision of meals and clean clothes, despite her disappointment. That evening, Margaret finally showed Luke the box of letters. She set it on the kitchen table next to the family Bible and waited while he read each one. Luke's face grew paler with each personal story, each account of faith and comfort that had been destroyed along with the statue. "I didn't know," he whispered. "After reading the last letter, I didn't know it meant so much to so many people." Margaret nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I didn't know either. Not completely. I knew the statue was important, but I didn't understand how deeply it had touched so many lives." She reached across the table and touched his hand gently. "Luke, what you did was wrong, but these letters aren't meant to punish you. They're meant to help you understand what you're being called to repair." Luke stared at the letters scattered across the table, each one representing a life that had been affected by his anger. The scope of the damage was overwhelming. But for the first time since throwing those stones, he felt something besides guilt and shame. He felt responsibility, not the crushing weight of condemnation, but the clear call to make things right. "How?" he asked simply. "How do I repair something like this?" Margaret smiled for the first time in a week. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think the first step is understanding what you've broken, and you're beginning to do that." That night, Luke read through the letters again on his own, slowly and carefully. Each story carved deeper awareness into his consciousness, helping him understand that the Virgin Mary statue hadn't been just a symbol of religious authority. It had been a vessel for human hopes, fears, and love. He had destroyed something irreplaceable, but perhaps somehow he could create something meaningful from the ruins. Margaret had been secretly collecting newspaper clippings about the incident, storing them in a manila folder hidden beneath the family Bible. She told herself she was documenting the aftermath for potential legal proceedings, but the truth was more complicated. Reading about Luke's actions in black and white somehow made them feel more real, more permanent, and therefore more devastating. The Cedar Falls Gazette had run the story on the front page. Local teen destroys sacred statue at Catholic school. The article included quotes from Principal Martinez, Father Miguel, and several longtime parishioners, expressing shock and disappointment. A sidebar piece detailed the statue's history, complete with a photograph from 1985 showing the families who had commissioned it, their faces bright with hope and determination in the aftermath of tragedy. Regional papers had picked up the story. Within days, the Bloomington Herald ran it under the headline, "Act of Vandalism Rocks Faith Community." The Springfield Journal-Register included it in a roundup of troubling trends in youth behavior. Each article added details Luke hadn't considered: the cost of the statue's creation, the artist who had carved it, the blessing ceremony that had made it sacred in the eyes of the church. Luke discovered the clippings on Saturday morning when he was looking for his birth certificate for the school board meeting. The folder fell from beneath the Bible, spilling newspaper pages across the kitchen table like evidence of a crime he was still committing. Seeing his actions documented in headlines and photographs was like being punched in the stomach. The same sick feeling, the same breathless shock, the same desperate wish that he could somehow undo what had been done. One article included a quote from his father that made Luke's blood turn cold. "I'm disappointed, but not surprised. The boy has always had anger management issues that his mother and I struggled to address." David Morrison had somehow been contacted by a reporter, despite having no contact with his family for months. The betrayal cut deeper than any criticism from strangers. Luke was still staring at the clippings when the phone rang. Margaret answered with the wary tone she had developed since the incident, never knowing if the caller would be supportive or condemnatory. "It's for you," she said, holding out the receiver with a puzzled expression. "Someone from Chicago." Luke took the phone hesitantly. "Hello?" "Luke, it's your father." The voice was familiar but distant, like an echo from a life Luke barely remembered. David Morrison sounded older, tireder than Luke remembered, but still, who carried the authority that had once made Luke eager for his approval. "I saw the news story," David continued without preamble. "We need to talk." Luke's hand tightened on the receiver. "We needed to talk 3 years ago. Where were you then? Don't get smart with me, son. You've made a mess that affects the whole. Family name? That includes me." The conversation that followed was devastating in its brevity. David expressed disappointment but offered no support, no guidance, no acknowledgement of his own role in Luke's anger and abandonment. He was calling not out of paternal concern, but out of embarrassment that his son's actions had brought negative attention to the Morrison name in communities where David might still have business connections. "Get yourself together, Luke," David said before hanging up, "and don't expect me to clean up your messes." Luke stood in the kitchen holding the dead phone, feeling more alone than he had since the day his father left. Margaret watched him with growing concern, recognizing the particular kind of pain that only parental rejection can inflict. That afternoon, Luke met with Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist Principal Martinez had recommended. Dr. Chen was in her 40s, calm and professional, with an office that smelled like vanilla candles and contained too many plants to count. She had treated dozens of teenagers struggling with anger, family disruption, and spiritual questioning. "Tell me about the statue," she said, after Luke had settled uncomfortably into the soft chair across from her desk. "Everyone keeps asking." "Me that," Luke said defensively. "I told everyone. I was angry. I acted stupid. I'm sorry. I'm not asking about everyone else's reactions," Dr. Chen said gently. "I'm asking about your experience. What did the statue represent to you in the moment you decided to destroy it?" Luke was quiet for a long time, struggling to put words to feelings he had never examined carefully. "It felt like it was watching me," he finally said. "Like it was judging me for not being good enough. not being faithful enough, not being the kind of son everyone wanted me to be. And destroying it made you feel powerful. For about 30 seconds, Luke's voice grew quieter. Then it made me feel empty, like I had broken something I could never fix. Dr. Chen nodded. Anger often masks other emotions, hurt, fear, sadness. When we can't express those feelings directly, they sometimes come out as destruction, but destruction never fixes what's really broken inside us. Over the next hour, Dr. Chen helped Luke begin to untangle the complex web of emotions that had led to his actions. His father's abandonment, his mother's struggle to maintain faith in the face of hardship, his own spiritual questioning in a community that seemed to offer no room for doubt. All of these had combined to create a pressure cooker of anger and confusion that had finally exploded. The statue wasn't your real enemy, Dr. Chen observed near the end of their session. It was a symbol of everything you felt powerless to change about your life. But symbols can't hurt us, Luke. Only our own unprocessed emotions can do that. Walking home from the therapy session, Luke found himself taking a detour past St. Catherine's. The memorial garden was cordoned off with yellow tape, the broken fragments of the statue removed, the flower beds trampled by the feet of investigators and cleanup crews. The space looked wounded, incomplete, like a smile with missing teeth. A small group of students was gathered at the school's entrance, and Luke recognized several classmates among them. As he approached, their conversation stopped, and he felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure. Luke. Ashley's voice was uncertain, neither welcoming nor hostile. She had been avoiding him since the incident, but now she seemed to be wrestling with conflicting loyalties and emotions. "Hey," Luke said quietly, unsure whether he should keep walking or try to engage. Jake Henderson looked uncomfortable but stepped forward. "Man, everyone's been talking about the statue. Some people are saying you should be expelled. Others are saying you need help more than punishment." Luke nodded, appreciating Jake's attempt at neutrality even though he could sense his former best friend's discomfort with the entire situation. "I saw the newspaper articles," Ashley said suddenly. "My dad, Principal Martinez, he's been getting calls from parents. Some want you gone permanently. Others think the community should focus on forgiveness and healing." The division Luke's actions had created in the community was becoming clearer. Some viewed his behavior as unforgivable sacrilege that warranted permanent exile. Others saw it as a cry for help from a troubled teenager who needed guidance and support rather than condemnation. "What do you think?" Luke asked Ashley, genuinely curious about her perspective as both the principal's daughter and his former girlfriend. Ashley considered the question carefully. "I think you did something terrible that hurt a lot of people," she said finally. "But I also think you're not the same person you were when you picked up those stones. The question is whether you're going to let this define you or whether you're going to find a way to make it right." That evening, Luke sat in his room, reading through the newspaper clippings again, this time with Dr. Chen's insights fresh in his mind. The articles weren't just documenting his crime, they were chronicling the community's attempt to process trauma, to understand how and why such destruction could occur in their midst. He was beginning to understand that his actions had created ripples far beyond his own family and immediate circle. The story had spread because it represented something larger than individual rebellion. It spoke to concerns about youth, faith, family breakdown, and the struggle to maintain sacred spaces in an increasingly secular world. But understanding the scope of the damage also revealed the scope of the opportunity for healing. If his destructive act had touched so many lives, perhaps an act of genuine contrition and repair could touch them as well. Word of Luke's mysterious illness and sudden recovery spread through Cedar Falls with the same speed that news of his destructive act had traveled weeks earlier. But this time, the whispered conversations carried notes of wonder rather than condemnation. Elena Morrison's friends from the prayer group began lighting vigil candles at St. Mary's, not just for Luke's continued healing, but for the community's healing from the wound his actions had created. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to approach Margaret after Sunday Mass, her weathered hands carrying a small white candle she had lit during the service. "I've been praying for your boy," she said quietly, her voice lacking the hurt and anger that had characterized their previous encounter. "What happened to him? The sickness and the healing. It reminds me of the stories my grandmother used to tell about saints and sinners and the ways God calls people back to himself." Margaret felt tears threatening as she accepted the candle. The shift in community sentiment wasn't universal, but enough people had witnessed Luke's genuine suffering and recovery to begin viewing his story through the lens of redemption rather than simple punishment. Father Miguel had spent considerable time in prayer about Luke's situation, and Sunday's homily reflected his growing conviction that the young man's spiritual crisis might serve a larger purpose in the community's relationship with faith and forgiveness. "Sometimes," Father Miguel told his congregation as Luke sat in a back pew with his mother and grandmother, "God allows us to see our own capacity for destruction so that we can also discover our capacity for restoration. Brokenness isn't the end of the story. It's often where the real story begins." Luke listened to these words with a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming responsibility. The community's growing willingness to see his actions as part of a larger spiritual narrative was healing. But it also meant that his response to this grace would be closely watched and evaluated. During the week following his recovery, Luke returned to his community service at St. Mary's with Tom Brennan, but his approach to the work had fundamentally changed. Where he had previously seen the tasks as punishment to be endured, he now understood them as preparation for something larger. Every hour spent tending the church grounds was teaching him about care, attention to detail, and the patient work required to maintain sacred space. "You're different," Tom observed on Wednesday as they worked together to repair a section of walkway damaged by winter frost. "Steadier, more focused." Luke paused in his work, considering how to explain the change he felt inside himself. "I think I understand now why the statue mattered so much to people," he said finally. "It wasn't just decoration. It was like a doorway to something bigger than themselves." Tom nodded approvingly. "That's the difference between religion and faith, son. Religion is about rules and buildings and ceremonies. Faith is about connection, hope, and love made visible in the world." That evening, Luke spread his homework across the kitchen table and began working on something that wasn't assigned by any school. Using graph paper borrowed from his mother's office supplies, he started sketching designs for a new Virgin Mary statue. The drawings were rough. Luke had no training in sculpture or design, but each one represented hours of careful thought about how to create something that would honor both the original statue's memory and the community's need for hope. Margaret found him still working on the sketches at midnight, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he erased and redrew Mary's outstretched arms for the dozenth time. "What's all this?" she asked gently, settling into the chair beside him. Luke looked up, suddenly self-conscious about his amateur attempts at design. "I want to replace the statue," he said. "Not just pay for someone else to do it, but really replace it. I want to be part of creating something beautiful where I created something ugly." Margaret studied the sketches spread across the table. They showed various poses and expressions for the Virgin Mary, but each drawing included one consistent element: children of different ages reaching up to touch the hem of her robe, kneeling in prayer at her feet, or simply standing in her presence with peaceful expressions. "These are beautiful, Luke," Margaret said, and she meant it. The technical skill might be limited, but the vision they represented was profound. But a statue like this would cost thousands of dollars, and it would need to be carved by a professional sculptor. "I know," Luke said. "I've been thinking about that. What if I tried to raise the money, not just from our family, but from the whole community? People could contribute not because they had to, but because they wanted to be part of creating something new and beautiful. Margaret felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation she had learned to recognize as maternal pride mixed with protective worry. Luke's idea was ambitious and generous, but it also opened him up to potential rejection and disappointment from a community still processing its feelings about his actions. It would mean talking to a lot of people, she said carefully. People who are still hurt by what you did. Some of them might not be ready to support you, no matter how sincere your intentions. Luke nodded, his expression serious. I know some people might not forgive me yet. Maybe some people won't ever forgive me, but I have to try. I can't just say I'm sorry and hope that's enough. I have to do something that shows I understand what I took away and that I want to give something back. Over the next few days, Luke refined his fundraising plan with the methodical approach he brought to everything that truly mattered to him. He researched local sculptors, calculated costs for materials and installation, and developed a timeline that would allow the new statue to be blessed and dedicated on the anniversary of the original statue's installation. Elena Morrison became his first official supporter, contributing $50 from her Social Security check and offering to help contact other parishioners who might be interested in contributing. This is good work you're doing, mijo, she told him, as they sat in her small apartment above the bakery, surrounded by the sketches he had brought to show her. But remember, the statue is just stone. The real healing happens in hearts, Father. Miguel agreed to let Luke present his proposal to the parish council, but cautioned him about expectations. Some people are ready to embrace your desire to make amends, Father Miguel said. Others are still processing their anger and hurt. You have to be prepared for both responses and remain committed to this path regardless of how many people initially support you. The parish council meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. Luke spent the days leading up to it practicing his presentation, anticipating questions and objections, and trying to prepare himself emotionally for possible rejection. Ashley Martinez surprised him by offering to attend the meeting as moral support. Their relationship remained undefined and complicated, but she had witnessed his genuine transformation and wanted to help however she could. You don't have to do this, Luke told her as they stood outside the church hall where the council met. Some people might think less of you for supporting me. Ashley smiled, the first unreserved smile he had seen from her since the incident. Maybe, she said, but they'll think less of me if I abandon someone who's genuinely trying to make things right. Inside the church hall, 12 council members sat around a rectangular table, their faces reflecting varying degrees of skepticism, curiosity, and hope. Luke recognized several of them: Mrs. Patterson from his neighborhood, Mr. O'Brien, who taught math at St. Catherine's, Mrs. Santos, whose letter had been among those his mother collected. Father Miguel introduced Luke and invited him to present his proposal. Luke stood at the front of the room, his sketches displayed on an easel, and began to speak about his vision for redemption made manifest in limestone and bronze. I can't undo what I did, he said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. I can't bring back the original statue or erase the hurt I caused, but I can try to create something new and beautiful in its place, not as payment for what I destroyed, but as a sign that brokenness doesn't have to be the end of the story. The questions that followed were probing but fair. How would funds be managed? Who would oversee the sculpture's creation? What guarantee was there that Luke's commitment wouldn't fade when the initial enthusiasm wore off? Luke answered each question thoughtfully, acknowledging the limitations of his age and experience while demonstrating the depth of his preparation and commitment. When Mrs. Santos asked him directly why the community should trust him after what he had done, Luke paused for a long moment before responding. You shouldn't trust me because of who I was when I threw those stones, he said quietly. You should Consider trusting me because of who I'm trying to become. And if that's not enough yet, I understand. I'll keep working to earn that trust, whether this statue gets built or not." The council voted to allow Luke to proceed with his fundraising efforts, with the understanding that any donated funds would be managed by the church treasurer, and that the final design would need approval from both the parish and the diocese. Walking home after the meeting, Luke felt simultaneously elated and terrified. He had been given permission to attempt something that might fail spectacularly and publicly, but he had also been given the chance to transform his story from one of destruction to one of restoration. The vigil candles in the church flickered behind them as they walked, each small flame representing someone's prayer for healing, hope, and the possibility that even the worst mistakes could become the foundation for something beautiful. Father Miguel had wrestled with the decision for 3 days before finally placing the church keys in Luke's hands. The young man's transformation seemed genuine, but giving him access to the sacred space where the broken statue fragments rested felt like an enormous act of faith, both in Luke and in the possibility of redemption itself. "The church will be empty from midnight until 5 in the morning," Father Miguel said quietly as they stood outside the heavy oak doors. "If you need this time alone with God and with what you've broken, then take it. But Luke, be honest in there. Don't perform for anyone, not even for me. Just be truthful about who you are and what you need." Luke's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the keys, feeling their weight as both privilege and responsibility. The metal was old and worn smooth by decades of use, and holding them felt like holding a piece of the community's trust. It was 11:47 p.m. when Luke unlocked the church doors and stepped into the familiar darkness. The space felt different at night, larger, somehow filled with shadows and the faint scent of candle wax and old wood. Emergency lighting cast a pale glow along the walls, creating pools of dim illumination that made the familiar space feel both welcoming and mysterious. The broken fragments of the Virgin Mary statue had been arranged on a simple wooden table in the alcove near the altar. In the low light, they looked like archaeological remains from some ancient civilization, pieces of a story whose meaning had been lost to time. Luke approached them slowly, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty nave. Kneeling before the table, Luke reached out and touched the largest fragment, a piece of Mary's face that included one intact eye and part of her serene mouth. The limestone felt cool and rough beneath his fingers, and for a moment he could almost see the original statue as it had been, whole and beautiful and offering comfort to anyone who sought it. "I don't know how to do this," Luke whispered to the empty church, his voice barely audible even to himself. "I don't know how to pray. I don't know how to ask for forgiveness. I don't even know if there's anyone listening." The silence that surrounded his words felt expectant rather than empty, as if the church itself was waiting for him to find the courage to speak his deepest truths. Luke closed his eyes and let the words come without editing or filtering them. Through what he thought he should say, "I was so angry," he said, his voice growing stronger. "At my dad for leaving. At my mom for still believing when prayers didn't bring him back. At everyone who seemed to have faith when I felt empty inside. The statue, it wasn't the problem. It was just the closest thing I could hit." As he spoke, Luke began to understand something that had eluded him through all the therapy sessions and community service and well-meaning conversations. His anger had never really been about faith or religion or divine expectations. It had been about feeling abandoned and powerless, about being 16 years old and watching the adults in his life struggle with problems that seemed impossibly large. "I broke something beautiful because I felt ugly inside," Luke continued, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. "I destroyed something that was helping other people because I couldn't help myself. And now I don't know how to fix any of it." The breakdown, when it came, was complete and overwhelming. Luke collapsed, forward onto the floor, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from some place deeper than his lungs. Every emotion he had suppressed, every fear he had denied, every moment of despair he had masked with anger poured out in waves that left him gasping and empty. He cried for his father's abandonment and his mother's sacrifices. He cried for the children who would no longer touch the Virgin's robe for luck, for the elderly parishioners who had lost a source of comfort, for the families whose memorial had been destroyed by his rage. Most of all, he cried for the boy he had been before anger consumed him, and for the man he was terrified he might never become. Time became irrelevant as Luke knelt among the broken fragments, his tears mixing with the dust of shattered limestone. The church around him remained silent and patient, offering no miraculous interventions or supernatural comfort, but providing something more precious, a safe space for the complete honesty that healing required. In the deepest part of the night, when his tears had temporarily subsided and his breathing had steadied, Luke found himself speaking to the fragments as if they could hear him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I'm sorry for the anger I couldn't control. I'm sorry for the beautiful thing I destroyed. I'm sorry for the people I hurt who never did anything to deserve it." He paused, struggling to find words for the emptiness that had driven his rage. "I don't know how to be better than I am. I don't know how to fix what I've broken. But I want to try. If there's any way to make this right, please help me find it." The silence that followed felt different somehow. Not empty, but full of possibility, as if his desperate honesty had opened a door he hadn't known existed. Luke remained kneeling among the broken pieces, waiting for something he couldn't name, hoping for grace he wasn't sure he deserved. Dawn was beginning to filter through the stained glass windows when Luke finally lifted his head from his hands. His tears had stopped, but something more profound had taken place in the hours of darkness, a surrender so complete that it had created space for something new to emerge. The broken fragments of the Virgin Mary statue looked different in the growing light. Where Luke had previously seen only destruction and irreparable loss, he now saw possibility. Each piece carried within it the memory of the whole, and together they told a story not just of brokenness, but of the love that had created beauty in the first place. "I can't fix what I broke," Luke said aloud, his voice hoarse from crying, but steady with newfound clarity. "But maybe I can learn from it. Maybe I can help create something new." As he spoke these words, Luke felt a shift inside his chest, not the crushing weight of guilt that had pressed down on him for weeks, but something lighter and more purposeful. The anger that had driven him to destruction hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into something that felt like determination. The tears that began flowing now were different from the anguished sobs that had racked his body through the dark hours. These tears felt cleansing, healing, as if they were washing away not just his guilt, but the spiritual emptiness that had made him so susceptible to rage in the first place. Luke touched his cheeks in wonder, amazed at how different crying could feel when it came from hope rather than despair. Father Miguel found Luke still kneeling in the alcove at 5:15 a.m., surrounded by the statue fragments, but radiating a peace that was unmistakable even from a distance. The priest approached quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever had transpired during the night hours. "Luke," Father Miguel said softly. Luke looked up, and Father Miguel was struck by the change in the young man's face. The defensive hardness that had characterized Luke's expression for months was gone, replaced by something that looked like hope mixed with profound humility. "I understand now," Luke said, struggling to find words for an experience that seemed to transcend language. "I understand what I really destroyed, and I understand what I need to do about it." Father Miguel knelt beside him, noting the tear stains on Luke's cheeks and the way his hands rested gently on the broken stone, as if blessing it. "What do you understand?" Luke was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "The statue was never about the stone," he said finally. It was about the love that created it, the hope that sustained it, and the community that gathered around it. I can't bring back the original, but I can help create a place for that love and hope to gather. Again, Elena Morrison arrived at the church 20 minutes later, led by an intuition that her grandson needed her presence. She found Luke and Father Miguel sitting together in comfortable silence, the statue fragments arranged between them like the pieces of a puzzle they were learning to solve together. "Mijo," Elena said, settling beside them with a grace that belied her 78 years. "How do you feel?" Luke looked at his grandmother, this woman who had prayed for his soul through his darkest period and never stopped believing in the possibility of his redemption. When he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised even him. "I feel forgiven," he said simply. "Not because I deserve it, but because that's what love does. It forgives even when forgiveness seems impossible." Elena's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. She had witnessed many moments of spiritual awakening in her long life, but seeing her grandson's face transformed by genuine grace was among the most beautiful. Margaret Morrison arrived at the church shortly after sunrise, drawn by the same maternal instinct that had awakened her when Luke was small and needed her during the night. She found her son, her mother-in-law, and their priest sitting together in the growing daylight, surrounded by the fragments of destruction that somehow no longer looked broken, but simply unfinished. "Luke," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion as she took in his peaceful expression and the tears that had clearly been shed in healing rather than despair. Luke stood and embraced his mother, this woman who had sacrificed so much for his education and well-being, who had defended him even when his actions seemed indefensible, who had never stopped loving him even when love felt impossible. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered against her shoulder. "I'm sorry for the anger, for the destruction, for making you choose between defending me and belonging to your community. I'm ready to make it right now. Not because I have to, but because I want to." As the sun rose fully and filled the church, with warm light, the four of them sat together among the broken fragments of the Virgin Mary statue. But what struck each of them was that the pieces no longer looked like evidence of destruction. Instead, they looked like the raw materials for something new and beautiful, waiting to be transformed by love, patience, and the kind of hope that can emerge only from complete brokenness. Luke Morrison had entered that church as a young man, crushed by guilt and anger. He was leaving as someone who understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that redemption wasn't something you earned, but something you received, and that receiving it fully meant dedicating your life to passing it on to others. The miraculous tears he had shed would be witnessed and remembered by those who found him, becoming part of a story that would spread far beyond Cedar Falls, a story of how grace could transform even the most destructive anger into something beautiful and life-giving. 3 months later, Luke Morrison knelt in the same memorial garden where he had once thrown stones in anger, but now his hands held a different tool entirely. The detailed drawings spread across the wooden table beside him showed plans for a new Virgin Mary statue, not a replacement for what he had destroyed, but something entirely new that honored both the original's memory and the community's journey toward healing. The fundraising had exceeded everyone's expectations. What began as Luke's desperate attempt at restitution had grown into a community-wide project that brought together people who had been divided by his initial act of destruction. Mrs. Rodriguez had been among the first contributors, pressing $20 into Luke's hand with the quiet words, "My daughter would have wanted this." Tom Brennan had organized a car wash fundraiser that raised over $800. Even Ashley's father, Principal Martinez, had contributed both money and administrative support, helping Luke navigate the complex process of commissioning a professional sculpture. The new statue would be larger than the original, carved from Georgia marble instead of Indiana limestone, and designed to incorporate elements suggested by community members during a series of planning meetings Luke had organized. Children would still be able to touch the hem of Mary's robe, but the new design also included a small reflecting pool where people could leave written prayers and a bench where families could sit together in contemplation. "The artist wants to meet with you next week," Margaret said, settling beside her son as he made final adjustments to the installation plans. "Maria Santos from Springfield. She's the sculptor who created the memorial at the state capitol." Luke nodded, still amazed that a professional artist of Maria Santos's caliber was willing to work with a 16-year-old who had gained notoriety for destroying religious art. But Father Miguel had convinced her to consider the project, emphasizing the redemptive nature of Luke's transformation and the community's investment in healing. "She wants to incorporate some of the original fragments into the new design," Margaret continued. "Small pieces worked into the base so that what you broke becomes part of what you're creating." The idea sent a chill through Luke, not of fear, but of recognition. The broken limestone pieces that had haunted his dreams for weeks would become all part of something beautiful and enduring. Destruction and creation would be forever linked in the memorial garden, telling a story of redemption that was more powerful than either element could tell alone. Elena Morrison approached them carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman whose prayers had been answered in ways she hadn't dared to hope. At 78, she had seen enough of life to understand that transformation was rarely dramatic and never easy. But Luke's change had been both profound and sustained. "Mijo," she said, pouring coffee into 3 cups she produced from her oversized purse. "Do you remember when you told me you couldn't touch my rosary beads because you didn't deserve to touch anything holy?" Luke accepted the coffee gratefully, thinking back to those dark days when guilt and shame had convinced him he was beyond redemption. "I remember feeling like I had put myself outside of God's reach," he said, "like I had done something unforgivable." Elena smiled and pulled her worn rosary beads from her pocket. The silver had grown even more tarnished over the months, and several beads showed new scratches from constant use. "These beads have been in my hands during every prayer I've said for you," she said, pressing them into Luke's palm. "They've absorbed months of petitions for your healing, your forgiveness, your transformation into the man God created you to be." This time Luke didn't pull away from the rosary. The metal felt warm in his hands, and he could sense the weight of prayer and love they carried. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered, "for never giving up on me." Father Miguel joined them in the memorial garden as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the construction area. The blessing ceremony for the new statue was scheduled for the following month, exactly 1 year after Luke had destroyed the original. The symmetry felt intentional, a sign that healing had its own timeline and rhythm. "How are you feeling about speaking at the dedication ceremony?" Father Miguel asked Luke. The young man had volunteered to address the community during the blessing, despite his lingering nervousness about public speaking. "Terrified," Luke admitted with a slight smile. "But I need to do it. People need to hear that change is possible, that making terrible mistakes doesn't have to define the rest of your life." Word of Luke's story had spread beyond Cedar Falls, carried by social media, newspaper articles, and the simple power of a narrative that offered hope in an era often marked by despair and division. A local television station had requested permission to film the dedication ceremony, and Luke had agreed, understanding that his story might encourage other young people struggling with anger and spiritual crisis. Jake Henderson had cautiously resumed their friendship over the past month, impressed by the consistency of Luke's transformation and drawn to participate in the statue project. Ashley Martinez had become something more than a friend, but less than a girlfriend, a relationship that felt appropriate for 2 teenagers learning that love sometimes meant giving each other space to grow. As evening approached, Luke gathered his drawings and prepared to head home for dinner with his mother. The memorial garden looked incomplete without its centerpiece, but he could envision how it would appear once the new statue was installed. Children would once again reach up to touch Mary's robe. Elderly parishioners would find comfort in her presence, and families would gather there for photographs and quiet conversations. But the new statue would tell a richer story than the original ever could. It would speak not just of faith and hope, but of the power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that communities could be strengthened rather than divided by honestly confronting their wounds. Luke Morrison had learned that breaking something sacred required only minutes of rage, but creating something meaningful demanded months of patient work, careful planning, and sustained commitment to becoming worthy of the trust others placed in you. As he walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Luke carried with him the knowledge that redemption wasn't a single moment of forgiveness, but a daily choice to live in a way that honored both the grace he had received and the community that had made space for his transformation. The vigil candles in St. Mary's Church flickered in the growing darkness, each small flame representing someone's continuing prayer for healing, hope, and the persistent possibility that love could indeed triumph over hatred, creation over destruction, and redemption over the worst mistakes human beings could make.